Scary telling.
I stood in the kitchen, staring at the array of ingredients spread out on the counter before me. It was our anniversary, and my wife and I had decided to recreate our first night together with a special meal. I picked up the meat tenderizer and began to hammer away at the expensive cut of meat we had purchased for the occasion. It was tough and unyielding, but I was determined to get it just right. As I worked, my wife chopped vegetables beside me, her knife slicing through the air with precision. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to feel my energy waning. The tenderizer felt heavy in my hand, and my arms ached with every blow. My wife's demands for perfection were wearing on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was letting her down. As we worked, the tension between us began to rise. I could feel her eyes on me, silently judging my every move. I wanted nothing more than to please her, but my exhaustion was making it hard to concentrate. Finally, after what felt like hours, we had everything prepared. The meat was tenderized, the vegetables were chopped, and the oven was preheated. My wife smiled at me, a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "It's going to be perfect," she said. I smiled back, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But as we began to cook, I could feel the tension building once again. My wife's insistence on perfection was grating on my nerves, and I found myself growing increasingly irritable. As we worked, I couldn't help but wonder if this was what our relationship had become, a never-ending quest for perfection, with no room for error or imperfection. I wanted to scream, to lash out at her and tell her that I couldn't take it anymore. But I kept my feelings bottled up inside, continuing to chop and slice and cook until the meal was ready. When we finally sat down to eat, I couldn't even taste the food. My mind was consumed with thoughts of how things had gone so wrong, and I knew that this meal would only mark the beginning of our troubles. As we began to cook, I could feel the tension building once again. My wife's insistence on perfection was grating on my nerves, and I found myself growing increasingly irritable. I tried to keep my feelings in check, but it wasn't long before something went wrong. I was chopping some vegetables when I accidentally sliced my finger with the knife. Blood immediately began to pour from the wound, mixing with the vegetables on the cutting board. My wife rushed over to me, trying to staunch the flow of blood with a dish towel. "Are you okay?" she asked, a note of concern in her voice. I nodded, trying to mask the pain. But the sight of the blood mixing with the vegetables made me feel sick to my stomach. I tried to continue cooking, but I could feel my hands shaking with fear and frustration. As we continued to cook, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The meal felt tainted somehow, as if the blood had seeped into everything we were preparing. My wife seemed oblivious to my unease, her attention focused solely on the task at hand. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to feel a sense of anger building inside me. I was exhausted, and my wife's constant demands were making it hard for me to focus. The sight of the blood mixing with the vegetables only served to fuel my frustration, and I found myself becoming increasingly irritable. Finally, I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the knife down on the cutting board and turned to face my wife. "Why do you always have to be so perfect?" I yelled. "Can't you see that you're driving me crazy?" My wife looked at me with shock and hurt in her eyes. I immediately regretted my outburst, but it was too late. The damage had been done. As we continued to cook, the tension between us grew palpable. I could feel my wife's eyes on me, silently judging my every move. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind was consumed with thoughts of how things had gone so wrong. By the time we had finished cooking, I was a mess. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the sweat pouring down my face. I wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed and forget this night ever happened. But I knew that wouldn't be possible. The events of the evening had changed everything between us, and I wasn't sure if we could ever go back to the way things were before. The tension between us had reached a boiling point, and I could feel my frustration growing with every passing minute. As we finished cooking, my wife suggested that we set the table together. But as we moved towards the cupboard to grab some dishes, I felt a sudden surge of anger. I grabbed the meat tenderizer from the sink and slammed it down onto the cutting board with a loud thud. The sound echoed through the kitchen, causing my wife to jump with fright. "What the hell are you doing?" she screamed. I didn't respond. I could feel my hands shaking with rage, and I knew that I was losing control. The meat tenderizer felt heavy in my hand, and I began to slam it down onto the cutting board again and again, creating a frenzied cacophony of noise. My wife tried to calm me down, but it was too late. The sight of the blood mixing with the vegetables had pushed me over the edge, and I was in the grip of a full-blown rage. As I continued to smash the meat tenderizer down onto the cutting board, I felt a sense of power coursing through my veins. It was as if I had tapped into a hidden well of strength, and I couldn't stop myself from lashing out. My wife screamed in terror and ran out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my rage. I continued to smash the meat tenderizer down onto the cutting board over and over again until I collapsed onto the floor in exhaustion. When I finally came to my senses, I was lying on the floor, covered in sweat and blood. I looked around the kitchen, and the scene before me was like something out of a nightmare. There was blood everywhere, on the cutting board, on the counter, on the floor. Vegetables were strewn about haphazardly, and the meat was nowhere to be seen. As I tried to make sense of what had happened, I knew that there was no going back. The events of the evening had changed everything between us, and I wasn't sure if we could ever recover from the horror that had unfolded in our kitchen. As I lay there on the floor, covered in blood and sweat, I couldn't help but think that something was off. The meat we had prepared for our anniversary dinner had tasted strange, almost metallic. I tried to push the thought from my mind, but it lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. I stumbled to my feet and surveyed the damage in the kitchen, trying to piece together what had happened. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The blood mixing with the vegetables, the frenzied smashing of the meat tenderizer, it was all too much to bear. My wife eventually came back into the kitchen, her face pale with fear. She looked at the scene before her with a mix of horror and disbelief. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. The events of the evening were too raw, too painful. Instead, I shrugged and muttered something about the meat being tough. But as we ate our dinner, I couldn't help but taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. It was like a reminder of the horrors that had unfolded in our kitchen, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of our relationship. As we finished our meal, I noticed my wife's eyes darting around the room nervously. She seemed on edge, as if she too could sense that something was off. Finally, she spoke up. "Do you think we did something wrong? Maybe we should have cooked the meat differently?" I didn't know what to say. The meat had tasted off, but I didn't want to admit the truth. Instead, I pushed my plate away and stood up from the table. "I don't feel well," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I need to lie down." My wife looked at me with concern in her eyes, but I brushed past her and headed towards the bedroom. As I lay down on the bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The metallic taste in my mouth lingered like a bad omen, a reminder of the horrors that had unfolded in our kitchen. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that I would never be able to forget what had happened that night. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy and disoriented. As I stumbled into the kitchen, I could still smell the metallic tang of blood in the air, a constant reminder of the horrors that had unfolded the night before. My wife was already up, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. She looked at me with a mix of fear and concern, as if she too could sense that something was seriously wrong. As we sat down to breakfast, I tried to push the events of the previous night from my mind. But the metallic taste in my mouth lingered, a constant reminder of the darkness that had consumed us. My wife eventually spoke up. "We need to talk about what happened last night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew she was right. The events of the evening had changed everything between us, and we needed to address the elephant in the room. As we talked, the truth slowly began to emerge. The blood mixing with the vegetables, the frenzied smashing of the meat tenderizer, it was all too much to bear. I admitted that I had been feeling overwhelmed and exhausted, and that the pressure of the evening had pushed me over the edge. My wife confessed that she too had been feeling the strain, and that her insistence on perfection had been a way to cope with her own fears and anxieties. Slowly but surely, we began to work through the issues that had driven us apart. We talked about our fears and insecurities, and we made a pact to be more open and honest with each other in the future. In the days and weeks that followed, we worked to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were times when we both struggled to move past the events of that night. But slowly but surely, we began to heal. The metallic taste in my mouth began to fade, replaced by the sweet taste of forgiveness and understanding. And as we sat down to dinner together, I knew that we had come out the other side stronger and more resilient than ever before. The horrors of that night had brought us to the brink, but in the end, they had also brought us closer together than we ever thought possible.